Hello, I'm Iris Hami, the owner of the Gil Travel Group in Philadelphia. As we continue our video webinar series today, we're presenting the Jewish South and in particular Nashville, Tennessee. We all know that Nashville is known for great country music, beautiful plantations, and great Southern food. But it also has a vibrant and dynamic Jewish community. We decided to interview Jean Roseman, a veteran of Nashville and author of Shalom Nashville. Her story tells us about the Jewish community starting in 1795, and now it has grown and flourished with the years. Today, the community, 10,000 strong, is enriched with 5 synagogues, a Jewish campus with a flourishing JCC, a growing Jewish federation, and continuous Jewish education for the younger generation. It even boasts two kosher restaurants. So let's listen to Joan to hear her story of Nashville.
Hi, Jean. Thank you so much for joining us at Gil Travel today. As I had mentioned, one of the things that we've been doing during this pandemic is trying to be a little creative and think a little bit out of the box. And we've created a number of domestic itineraries for our clients, perhaps thinking that maybe some people would be more comfortable traveling within the United States before venturing out internationally. I wanted to offer them an opportunity also to explore a new place, a new destination, and also to look at that from the point of view also from the Jewish components. And when we met you with one of our other groups that had come to Nashville, and we said, wow, this might be a fabulous opportunity to meet you and to help us with your expertise, get to know Nashville a little bit before we bring a group there, and to whet people's appetite. I think that people might know Nashville for the music and for its cooking, its culinary. I'm not so sure that Nashville is always recognized for its Jewish Southern roots, and we look forward to hearing about your area of expertise. But perhaps you can start by sharing a little bit about yourself and your connection to Nashville, and then we'll move on from there.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. I grew up in Boston, so I had an urban soul when I arrived in Nashville, which was a small, big town, a sleepy southern town. And it has absolutely exploded since then. I've been here 51 years, so I've been able to see that happen. It's been an amazing community, and the Jewish community currently is about 8,000, although we think it's much larger with unaffiliated Jews, but that's hard to really find. I taught German and Holocaust history at a local high school, and I have 2 children. One is a lawyer, one is a veterinary anesthesiologist in another community. I'm currently widowed, and I have this picture which shows Ben Schulman, birthday being celebrated. He was 100 years old. He was an interesting person. I'm not jumping right into his story, but I happened to do a PowerPoint presentation on his childhood in Nashville. He grew up to be a Navy man during the World War II and went on to make a fortune. And in the end, he dedicated to start a Hillel at Vanderbilt. So that's Vanderbilt University. So, he's been important in the community and one of many fine people that have come out of the Nashville Jewish community.
Wow. We've been talking a lot, you and I, even before we started recording, about the pandemic, and wondered how has the pandemic impacted the Jewish community in Nashville?
Well, fortunately, it has not taken any lives that we know of. We just don't think so. But the Jewish community has shown a tremendous resourcefulness in dealing with the pandemic. Immediately, they closed all their institutions, 5 synagogues, the JCC, just everything was closed down, adapted very quickly to Zoom alternatives, and they have gone off extremely well. And the second area of concern was seniors, very, very much so, because seniors have been the vulnerable population. And so they have been delivering meals. I am one who gets 2 meals. Thursday's the most exciting day because I don't know what I'm going to get. And not only 1 meal, but 2 meals. And they're made by a kosher chef here in Nashville who grew up in Israel and South Africa. So he had an interesting background, interest-wise and food-wise. Anyway, they've taken care of their seniors and taken care of the community in general. The beginning of phased reopening now. We're not sure what will happen with the high holidays. Chances are they will be Zoomed. We hope not. Anyway, the pandemic has definitely hit Nashville. We've had about 7,500 cases here and 89 people dead as of yesterday. So and now, unfortunately, because we're one of those southern states that's opening ahead, our numbers are beginning to go up.
Right. I know that you were a teacher for over 30 years, and that you told me that your second career is being an author. I said author extraordinaire. You didn't say that. And I wondered, how did you get involved and interested in all this Jewish Nashville, Jewish Southern stuff? How did that happen?
Well, it happened because I was retired. And I thought, I'm going to read a book about Nashville's Jewish history. I don't know anything about it. So I went to the Jewish Community Center Library and I asked the librarian / archivist for a book. And there were two written by Fedora Frank. But before I go there, I just want to say that Fedora Frank was one of the most interesting people. She felt too the need for a Jewish history of Nashville, but she did not type. She did not have a copy machine. She certainly had no computer. Her books were published in 1962 and 1976. So this woman hand wrote everything.
Wow.
And another important person in preserving the history was Annette Levy Ratkin. She married again. And she brought a whole new concept to us, that of preserving the history in terms of archiving. And there is an extraordinarily, really professional archive at the Jewish Community Center. Nashville has been a very stable community. It's only been really in the last 2 decades that Nashville had a lot of, not that they brought them in, but other Jews from elsewhere have come here to Nashville to live. But up until then, it was mainly families that came here, settled, their children grew up here, the children went into their father's businesses and married girls in the community. One of the things that was that everybody was related here in Nashville. They were double first cousins and things that I couldn't always penetrate complex. But Nashville has done a great deal to preserve its history. And I go to read a book that brings me up to the present. Fedora Frank's books had stopped at 1901. She said quite loudly, "I will not write about anyone living." So I thought, somebody's got to write about it. So I did, first of all, a book about the MHA and then the JCC. And then I bounced into doing a huge compendium of Nashville's Jewish history. So it was lacking, and I saw a need for it.
So Jean, I wanted you to ask you if you could tell us a few things that you learned about the Nashville Jewish community that actually surprised you.
Okay, well, to know what really kind of surprised me was that the community itself was not even settled. There were not people here until 1780. In 1795, 15 years later, the first Jews came here, and they came from New York. And the woman was pregnant, and she had her baby in December of 1795, and then they moved on. So the first Jews were here. The interesting thing is that their children came back to settle in Nashville because there were such wonderful tales of abundant wildlife and good water and wonderful fertile ground and so forth. And their children came back, and they're still here, and descendants are. So that was the first thing that surprised me, that already in 1795, there was a Jewish presence in this community. And then it was quickly followed by traders coming down the river from Since, which was filled with German Jews. And so they brought the German reform ideas with them. Nashville has been probably very outstanding German Jewish community, rather Jewish reform community. And then I was very impressed with two of the early people who pulled the community together about 50 some years after the first Jews were here. Isaac Garretson, who lived in this house, I hope you're able to show it this time, which is still standing. One of the few houses in Nashville that had torn down. And that was a pre-Civil War building, but it's just filled with history, even though it's undergone a lot of changes, but it's been saved. Isaac Garretson pulled together the first minyan, and then made sure that it happened thereafter. It was a little difficult for the early Jews in town to settle on the minhag, but they did eventually. And then interesting also is the fact that he was in an intermarriage. And his wife died before him. And of course, he wanted her buried in the Jewish cemetery. And some of the locals put up a protest. And so he implored the rabbi of New Orleans to certify her. She had converted in Holland before she came. And so anyway, that was the first intermarriage that we knew. And then there was this marvelous woman, Betty or Bertha Lusky. She was born in 1820 in Poland, and she became the second wife of a man who was widowed and had one child. She came to America with him in 1850. They made their way to Nashville. Okay. He dies after the Civil War. He goes on to be an outstanding leader in the community, and she commissioned the first Torah to be made for Nashville. And let me tell you, she died in 1927. So how old did that make her? It was 107 years old.
Wow.
Best we know, obviously so many migrants did not have birth certificates at all. But she was very, very old, and she made a big difference in the community. And then another thing that somewhat surprised me was how old the Jewish cemetery was and how historical it is. And there are two appended parts. There's one for the conservative group in Nashville and one for the Orthodox. And it's some vast historical, all these tombstones really intrigue me. And I occasionally give walking tours particularly of the Reform Cemetery. So it's been a very, very interesting time in Nashville for Jewish history. On top of that is probably one of the most unusual gravestones in any Jewish cemetery. It's of a young boy who's, you're not going to find this too believable, but right after the Civil War, they were divorced. And he was given custody of the child. I've actually read the handwritten divorce bill. Anyway, he had custody of the child, but the child died at 10 years of age. And if you can see this figure now, standing, a human figure, you never see that in a Jewish cemetery, almost never.
Wow.
This 10-year-old boy looking brightly with his father's monument standing over him, protecting him.
Wow.
It's really a lovely story.
Wow.
And, it's just part of Nashville's history. Also, one of the things that surprised me was the very exotic building, the Vine Street Temple, that the Reform community built downtown. Locals referred to it as the Hebrew Church. Jews were very well accepted in Nashville. They were seen as people of the book, people of God, and they, I have to admit this, they were white. So that was another thing here in the Deep South that worked in their favor. And they took care of their own so that not create a problem for the community. Therefore, the community was very supportive of them. And when the Vine Street Temple was dedicated in 1874, the former US President, Andrew Johnson, came for the, and the governor was there, and the mayor was there, and about 1,000 townfolk were there. And there was a joke about that Vine Street Temple. The Vine Street Temple had a house that belonged to a family named Page, the Vine Street Christian Church. And locals always joked about how the Page house was the page between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And both those religious places did not move until after World War II, when parking became a problem and downtown had moved to suburban malls. So there was what I wish I could have seen that particular building. It was so exotic. It had 9 towers, very Byzantine. But of course, with the zeal of people who want to put up new buildings, it came down. And they moved on out to the suburbs. And then there was the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. That was the Hungarian shul, and very Orthodox, as you can imagine. They bought a house, and they bought it next to the Ryman Auditorium. Ryman Auditorium was a church and then changed to being an entertainment venue. And when the Orthodox built a new shul there, what happened? People who wanted to hear music didn't realize that this was not some sort of adjunct building for the Ryman. And wander in and say, what kind of music is that? Everybody always joked about that. But all the synagogues from are gone, unfortunately. Anyway,
well, when we come to Nashville, we'll see what synagogues are existing now. I'm sure that we'll be able to take a tour of that and meet with the members of some of the members of the community. Jean, I have a question. If you could, what do you think would be a unique characteristic of the current Jewish community in Nashville? What's unique about their community, your community?
General, I would say it's wonderful durability. Then I would add its community commitment to Nashville as a whole. But also some of the people that have come out of the past have been really remarkable. One in particular, her name was Annie Garfinkel, and she had a couple of brothers who were lawyers, and she had a steel-trap mind. She graduated from the premier high school downtown, but she was always made to listen to Bible verses in the, go to various assemblies in the school that were religious. And so she went before the school board when she was 18 years old and said, look, this is a violation of my constitutional rights to make me do this. And everybody, even the two Jewish members on the school board, were aghast that she would argue that. And her whole, if you can't do it in the churches or in your homes, what makes you think you're going to do it in the schools? And they were appalled. And the newspapers just downed her. She became a strong Zionist eventually. She was a woman who believed that Jews could do agriculture in Israel and let them do it. And she was marvelous. And then there were a number of women who were very supportive of an event that will be celebrated this year, and that is, of course, women's suffrage, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And these Jewish women were very much hurt, as was one rabbi. The Reform Temple, already before the amendment was passed in 1920 rather, had a woman on its board. So that was a big step forward. And then there was the man who was blind, who at the end of World War I heard about German soldiers who had been gassed with mustard gas and lost their eyesight, and he was blind. So he decided he would go alone and find out about these seeing eye dogs that he was being told about. And so he did. He brought the first seeing eye dog back to Nashville, a female dog named Buddy, and for whatever reasons. And he then he started a school here in Nashville, and Nashville allowed dogs at that time on the streetcars and in the stores and so forth. So he used the down training ground, and he started the first seeing eye dog school in America. He moved to Morristown, New Jersey eventually. And then my absolute favorite person is Dinah Shore. Anybody under 50 doesn't see. Yes, you know?
Of course.
She's probably the most famous Jew of her time to come out of the South, the entire South.
Wow.
She won America's heart. She was with the USO, first woman to go abroad with the USO and entertain the troops. She was an extraordinary person. And she was the original Oprah. And she was. And, Oprah is also from Nashville.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Actually, born, I think, in St. Louis, but she grew up here with her father. Her parents were divorced. Wow. Dinah Shore's life is remarkable. Many people remember her for being involved with Burt Reynolds. Much more to her story than that, and worth knowing. And then there's Mortimer May, who was the celebrated hero of a book called Foot Soldier in Zion. He was probably the most famous Zionist in America after World War II, and he came from a Reform family. So, there have been a lot of interesting people who have made great contributions in local life or national. So Nashville has its of interesting people.
So when we come to visit Nashville, how can we experience some of these things for ourselves?
Well, what you need to do is look at the various synagogues because they tell a history in themselves. The oldest, of course, is the Reform Synagogue. It actually began in 1851. So I won't ask you how old it is. It has a long history and well preserved, I must say. And then you would need to go to the West End Synagogue, which is, of course, a conservative synagogue. And when they had their first succession of rabbis, they all had German accents or Polish accents or whatever. And so happy when in World War II, they got their first rabbi who didn't have an accent. Now, years later, they have just put in a rabbi who is from Argentina, Buenos Aires, and of course he speaks Spanish and he has an accent and he's much beloved in the community. So West End Synagogue is definitely worth visiting. Plus that rabbi is fluent, absolutely fluent in Hebrew. And then you have synagogue right up the street from the West End Synagogue. And it's a lovely, lovely building with great windows, stained glass windows, and a very strong but small congregation. And of course, they have the highest birth rate of any of the congregations in Nashville, but nonetheless, the rabbi is so much beloved in the community. And then there's a fourth synagogue, which was a split off from the, excuse me, from the Reform, and for two reasons. The supposed reason was intermarriage. At the time, in 1992, the Reform rabbi at the historical temple would not intermarry anybody on the bima. And so, that caused a number of people whose children were marrying others to be upset. So 80 families got together and formed another synagogue. But the second reason is it was time. The membership at the temple, one's the temple and the other's Micah, but the membership at the temple was very, very top heavy almost. There were almost too many. And so they have a second Reform temple called Micah, which is very vibrant, very vigorous, and very successful. It has a husband and wife rabbi team.
Oh, cute. Okay, it's interesting.
Right, and they do extremely well, and they've got more than 400 families, whereas the temple has more than 700. And I belong to this is the best situation for me. And then the one thing that I would urge you to see with the group in Nashville is the Holocaust Memorial. That is on the JCC, and it is on a hillside that is not so much in sight. If you drive in, your back is almost immediately to the hill, so that people don't tend to see it. You have to know to go there. And it was done with 18 chairs, and there's a book that is torn because the people of the book, because of the Holocaust, have suffered so much. It's highly symbolic, and it's done in metal. It's really very moving. And there's video accompaniment and so forth. But somebody vandalized it last week.
Yes, I heard about that. I read it in the news, actually. Yeah.
Well, it was unfortunate because I really searched and I did not find almost any situation where there had been vandalism by any community-led movement in Nashville. There have been a few outside groups that have come in and created a problem, And that's too much in our country now. But Nashville has liked its Hebrew church and its descendants and so forth. Nashville has supported them. There was a bombing in 1988 at the JCC, but it was a desegregation matter. And so, it wasn't so much against Jews as it was Jews were perceived as having someone that came to the JCC. It was in another location at the time, and they never solved it.
Wow.
And they may not solve this current vandalism, but it's not typical of Nashville. Most Jewish people feel very much at home here. In fact, don't feel very cautious because it's a accepting community. So I would urge you to come. Do not be aware of any problems here, at least generated by Nashvillians.
Right. And is there a favorite place you have in Nashville?
My favorite place is Centennial Park. There's a replica of the actual Parthenon in Centennial. And it is really a beautiful structure. It was put up as a temporary structure. Any other buildings, all in Centennial Park. And it was a huge exposition of Tennessee's 100th year of statehood in 1897. The year's not right because there had been problems with sickness in 1896, so they weren't able to have it. They put up all these temporary buildings, and then they were taking them down. Nashville people started to say, we don't want that Parthenon to go. So 20 years later, they had erected in its place a very solid Parthenon, and people come to see it. It is an extraordinarily nice park with a lake, and it's a pleasant place to go and just sit on a blanket and picnic and walk around. And
so it sounds like it might be a good place for us to do a picnic with Southern fried chicken and some of those typical Southern foods that maybe that chef that you spoke about earlier who makes your dinner for Thursdays, maybe he could prepare it for us. We'll have to think of something really cool, and of course a Southern cuisine for our guests. But I do think that you've given us a really rich idea of some of the really rich and thorough history that the Jewish community has had there for a very, very long time. And Jean, I hope that we'll be able to ask you to join us when we bring our groups there so we could meet you in person and you can actually take us to some of the places that you've described here.
Well, I would be delighted. I did it recently with a group of Israeli visitors, the pandemic, and they loved Nashville. Nashville's a very popular tourist spot. We had 17 million visitors here last year.
Wow. Well, I can imagine that with your country music and with your line dancing, that we have all those things on the agenda, and a tour with you and a visit to the synagogues and the Southern cuisine. I cannot wait to be able to travel together, to meet with you, to bring a group to meet you and to Nashville. And in the meantime, I wish you good health. And thank you so, so much for joining us today, Jean.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it.